In the shadow of the tree, a choice was made between eternal grace and the fall of man. Behold the knowledge of good and evil.
Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we are going to unpack something truly fascinating today. We'll be impartially mapping out a massive clockwork-like 17th century style doctrinal exposition. And listen, I want to be absolutely clear right up front. We are entirely neutral here. We aren't taking any religious sides, we aren't preaching, and we're definitely not trying to sway you one way or another. Instead, we're going to look at this text objectively, almost like we're studying a breathtaking piece of structural theological architecture. We are going to explore its incredibly intricate, almost mathematical logic regarding the origins of evil, the literal biological nature of human corruption, and a sprawling, universe-sized concept of cosmic redemption. To tackle a text that's this dense and complex, a highly structured approach is really the only way to do it justice. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let's get started on mapping this all out.
Here is our agenda for today's explainer. 1. The paradox of knowledge. 2. A biological contamination. 3. The severe mercy. 4. The ultimate human substitute. 5. Reversing the fall. And 6. The cosmic expansion.
Let's move right into section 1, the paradox of knowledge.
So the text hinges its entire redemptive history on this single mind-bending paradox regarding the nature of good and evil. Now you might be wondering, what exactly is this paradox? Well, in Genesis chapter 3, right after the fall in the Garden of Eden, God actually notes that man has become as one of us, to know good and evil. Think about that for a second. God obviously knows good and evil, and according to the internal logic of this text, he is the absolute, flawless standard of holiness. But the exact moment man acquires that same knowledge, he is utterly destroyed. It completely breaks him. To resolve this massive contradiction, the author argues that we actually have to zoom out. We have to look outside of human history altogether to the spiritual realm, way prior to humanity's creation. The text insists that evil is not a created substance. It's not some yin and yang dualism where light and dark are equal and opposing forces, right? God didn't create evil the way he created gravity or thermodynamics. No, evil is defined strictly as a departure, a deliberate, calculated violation of God's established will, originating with Lucifer's choice to covet a position above his assigned station. Therefore, God already knew about evil long before Eden even existed because he had already witnessed it and judicially dealt with it.
And this brilliantly illustrates the text's oncologist analogy, which I think is absolutely crucial for wrapping our heads around this. The text draws a razor-sharp contrast between God's external, diagnostic understanding of a disease and man's fatal attempt to understand it by actually getting infected. It makes a fundamental distinction between two completely different ways of knowing something. God's knowledge is ontological and judicial. Because he is absolute good, he recognizes evil instantly as a departure from his own nature, and he judges it, much like a judge evaluating a crime from the bench without actually having to commit the crime to understand it. God is like a world-class oncologist. The oncologist knows literally everything about cancer. They know its cellular progression, its lethality, its mutation rates, but their knowledge is purely diagnostic. They exist completely outside the disease. Now, imagine if an otherwise healthy person decides they want that exact same knowledge. But instead of studying it externally, they try to get it by exposing themselves to a massive lethal dose of radiation. They don't magically gain diagnostic wisdom, do they? No, they just get horribly infected. When humanity reached for the fruit, they attempted to gain divine diagnostic knowledge through a localized experiential method, and the result wasn't wisdom at all. It was a fatal systemic infection.
That perfectly tees up section 2, a biological contamination.
The author systematically asserts that the serpent didn't just walk up and offer a piece of fruit like a bad snack choice. No, he pitched a highly sophisticated, three-pronged counterfeit ladder to divinity, using very specific psychological channels. The text maps the events of Eden directly over to the first epistle of John, which famously warns against three things: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Watch how perfectly this aligns. Eve saw the tree was good for food. Boom, that's the lust of the flesh. It was pleasant to the eyes. There's the lust of the eyes. And most crucially, it was desired to make one wise. That is the pride of life. The serpent essentially ran a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He imputed jealousy to the Creator, suggesting that God was intentionally holding back humanity's true potential. It was pitched as this incredible opportunity to level up their existence, but the text argues it was actually a trapdoor. It was a one-way ticket into absolute biological depravity. They thought they were hacking the system to become gods, but they were actually downloading a fatal virus. Now, what's really interesting about this exposition is its radical leap into divine biology. It claims that humanity was originally sustained by pure water. Yes, you heard that right. The text insists that when Genesis says Adam and Eve were created in the image of God entirely without corruption, that purity didn't just apply to their morals. It applied to their physical, cellular constitution. According to this framework, the original bodily fluid flowing through Adam and Eve's veins was not blood as we know it today. It was pure, clear water, which the text explicitly calls the water of life. The author directly connects this back to the Gospel of John, where Jesus offers a Samaritan woman a well of water springing up into everlasting life. Now, traditionally, scholars have always read that as purely a spiritual metaphor, but this exposition argues that it carries a dual meaning, that it's actually a literal callback to humanity's original, pristine, unfallen biological state. It's a mind-bending way to read the text, for sure.
Building on that, the text argues that the fall wasn't merely a broken moral rule. It wasn't just, oops, I broke a commandment. It was a literal biochemical contamination that permanently overwrote humanity's physical hardware. When they ate the fruit, a catastrophic nature change occurred instantaneously. The spiritual corruption they embraced manifested completely physically, turning that pure, clear water into tainted, mortal red blood. The author anchors this huge claim in Leviticus 17, which bluntly states, the life of the flesh is in the blood. So, pre-fall, life was sustained by pure water. Post-fall, the very life principle of humanity became a carrier of mortality. It's like a computer virus. Think of Adam as the master file of the entire human race, running on a pristine, flawless operating system. When he consumes the fruit, he downloads a catastrophic virus that fundamentally rewrites his core code. And because he is the master file, every single human being copied from that file ever since is running on that exact same corrupted code. That is exactly why, as the text notes from the book of Romans, chapter 5, death reigns over everyone. Even infants who never committed a conscious act of rebellion are subject to it. The corruption isn't just behavioral, it is profoundly structural and biologically inherited.
Let's move to Section 3, the severe mercy.
According to the text, God barring access to the tree of life wasn't an act of punitive anger. It wasn't God throwing a temper tantrum and kicking them out of the house. It was actually a severe mercy, and it hinges entirely on one single word, lest. God stations cherubim with a flaming sword to intentionally, physically block their access to immortality. Now, why on earth would he do that? From a normal human perspective, if your child breaks a rule, you might discipline them, but you don't permanently evict them and bar the door with a flaming sword. But the text argues that we have to look at the sheer physics of the situation. If they had eaten from the tree of life in their brand new, corrupted state, the results wouldn't just have been bad, they would have been eternally catastrophic.
So the absolute crucial point here is that if Adam had achieved immortality in his newly infected state, humanity would have shared the exact, unredeemable fate of the fallen angels. The text references Romans 8, which states that the fallen, carnal mind is fundamental enmity against God. It is hostile to its core. Now think about the math of this. Immortality plus a rebellious, corrupted mind means you are permanently, irrevocably frozen in a state of corruption. The fallen angels, as noted in the Epistle of Jude, are immortal beings who rebelled. And because they are immortal, because they literally cannot die, they cannot be run through a redemptive process. Because redemption requires death and resurrection. So they are locked in chains forever. If Adam had grabbed that fruit of immortality, it would have been game over for the entire human race, period. Therefore, introducing physical mortality was a drastic but necessary rescue mission. Much like a seed in agriculture has to die and go into the ground to bring forth new life, physical death became the necessary, unavoidable doorway for redemptive resurrection. You simply cannot resurrect a being that cannot die.
By introducing mortality as this necessary system reboot, the text notes that fixing this massive physical and spiritual debt now requires a mathematically precise legal substitute. The non-negotiable economic rule of this universe is what we could call the principle of equivalent worth. It means that an infinite rebellion against a perfectly holy God requires an equally infinite payment. And because, as we established, the life is in the blood, the shedding of blood is the only legally recognized currency in this system. But the text argues that the thousands of years of animal sacrifices, the endless parade of bulls and goats in the Old Testament, entirely failed to solve the foundational problem. The Hebrew word for atonement, kafar, literally means to cover. Animal sacrifices merely deferred judgment. They covered it up temporarily, but they couldn't remove the internal biological virus. Why? Because of that principle of equivalent worth. A goat lacks moral agency. It is not made in the image of God. It completely lacks the ontological weight to serve as a true substitute for a human being. It's just the wrong currency. It's literally like trying to pay off a $10 million mortgage with monopoly money.
The bank isn't going to accept it. You need a human substitute to pay for human debt.
Which brings us to Section 4, the ultimate human substitute.
Because the life of the flesh is in the blood, the exposition argues that an infinite rebellion against a holy God requires an infinite payment of life. The law demands a human death to pay for a human sin. But here is the massive, seemingly unsolvable problem. Every single fallen human is already bankrupt. We all carry the corrupted bloodline, and we all carry our own infinite sin debt. So, if a normal, everyday human dies, they are simply paying their own wage. They are just covering their own tab. They have zero surplus value to apply to anyone else's account. It's like a compounding credit card debt where humanity is just desperately paying the minimum balance every month, but the principal keeps growing. To actually clear the ledger once and for all, you need a sinless billionaire to walk in and pay off the principal in one massive transaction. But since every single human is born in debt with corrupted blood, where do you find one?
This is where the text frames the virgin birth, not as some kind of whimsical magic trick or just a nice holiday story, but as the ultimate, legally required biological loophole. It was the only way to extract an uncorrupted human from a fully infected bloodline. This completely reframes the entire narrative of the Incarnation. It is presented as a highly technical, legally binding biological extraction. Because the text assumes the corruption is passed down specifically through the paternal line, if Jesus had a human father, he would have inevitably inherited the infected mortal blood. He would have been disqualified from day one. The virgin birth allowed him to be fully human, which, remember, is required to pay the human debt, but to completely bypass the corrupted paternal bloodline. The text focuses really heavily on Acts 20 here, which speaks somewhat mysteriously of the blood of God. Christ's blood is entirely unique in this framework. It is divine, which gives it infinite worth. It is human, which allows for legal substitution. And it is totally uncorrupted by the Adamic virus.
Now, I really need you to pay attention to this next point, because there is a massive, absolutely crucial distinction the author makes here that overturns a lot of popular assumptions. The author explicitly, categorically states that Christ was not the lamb for paying for sins. Let me repeat that because it's the crux of this entire legal argument. Christ was not the lamb for paying for sins. He did not die as a lamb to pay the sin debt. In the strict Old Testament Levitical law, lambs were almost never used for individual sin offerings. Those specifically required bulls or goats. So what was the lamb for? The primary function of the lamb was the Passover in Egypt, which catalyzed liberation from slavery. The lamb's blood painted on the doorpost didn't make the Israelites morally holy or forgive their sins. It delivered them from physical bondage so they could be free to serve God. Therefore, when the text uses the title Lamb of God, it signifies a cosmic liberation from the slavery of the corrupted source code. But, and this is absolutely vital, when it came to actually paying the mathematical, ontological debt for sin, Christ died as a fully uncorrupted man. He died as a man to be the only acceptable equivalent substitutional sacrifice for mankind's debt. A lamb cannot pay a human debt. Only a perfect man can.
Let's see how this plays out in Section 5, Reversing the Fall. The crucifixion is presented here as a mathematically precise, point-for-point mirrored reversal of Eden. It perfectly unspools the biological damage like a reversed video. The Apostle Paul famously calls Christ the last Adam or the second Adam, and the parallels the text draws are stunning. The first Adam took fruit from a living tree, brought death, internalized corruption into his bloodstream, and had his side open in a deep sleep to bring forth his wife. The second Adam was nailed to a dead tree, brought life, completely bypassed the corruption, and had his side open in the deep sleep of death. Everything is inverted with breathtaking, deliberate structural symmetry. The argument is that every single microscopic gear of damage caused back in Genesis has an exact, equally weighted, necessary countergear turning in the Gospels to undo it.
The exposition insists that this physical event on the cross was a literal biological expulsion of the systemic infection, providing the exact counterweight to the fall. When the Roman soldier pierced Christ's side on the cross, the Gospel of John specifically records that blood and water flowed out. Now, the text argues this is absolutely not just a random physiological detail to prove he was dead. The uncorrupted divine blood flowed out to permanently pay the infinite life debt demanded by the law's strict economy. And simultaneously, the pure water flowed out to declare the total restoration of humanity's original pre-fall purity. Remember the water of life from earlier? The Apostle John insists on this exact double witness in his first epistle, stating that Jesus came by water and blood, directly countering any idea that you could separate his human purity from his divine sacrifice. It is a completely closed-loop system of profound, interlocking theological complexity.
And that brings us to our final leg, Section 6, the cosmic expansion.
The exposition meticulously charts a sprawling, massive timeline where mortal survivors eventually enter an ecologically restored earthly kingdom, actually living right alongside immortal beings. Let me break this down. For individuals right now, today, the text outlines regeneration, which is the spiritual fix, and justification, which is the legal fix. But obviously our physical bodies still age and die. The hardware itself still needs redemption. Now the standard pathway for that is resurrection, where mortals put on immortality at Christ's return. But the text outlines a fascinating second pathway for a very specific group, the survivors of the Great Tribulation. These are individuals who somehow survive the apocalyptic judgments and enter a literal 1,000-year physical reign on Earth, but they enter it in their natural mortal bodies. They literally coexist on a restored Earth with immortal, resurrected beings. According to the book of Isaiah, their lifespans are vastly extended. People are living for centuries again, like back in Genesis, but they are still technically running on Adam's corrupted, mortal biological hardware, which means, theoretically, they can still age.
And here is where we see a breathtaking display of symmetry. The text argues that the very tree that was locked down in Genesis is finally, officially reopened in Revelation to physically heal those exact survivors. At the end of that 1,000-year period, we finally reach the eternal state in the New Jerusalem. And what do we find sitting right there in the center? The tree of life. The exact same tree that was blocked by the cherubim and the flaming sword back in Genesis chapter 3. Revelation 22 notes that the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Now, the text argues this isn't about curing sickness like catching a cold, because sickness is already totally eradicated by this point in the timeline. No, this healing is the final physical immortalization for those natural mortal bodies that survive the millennium. God finally permanently grants them the physical immortality that Adam was barred from possessing. The infinite debt has been paid by the blood, their natures have been regenerated, the structural virus is neutralized, and the flaming sword is finally, forever sheathed.
This brilliantly illustrates the ultimate, sweeping vision of the text. God's original command to multiply was never actually revoked. It was just paused until the source code could be fully patched and debugged. Way back in Genesis 1, God commanded humanity to be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. The text insists that redemption doesn't just save people from a negative fate. It isn't just fire insurance. It restores them to fulfill that massive original job description. In the new heaven and new earth, this redeemed, newly uncorrupted branch of humanity will continue to multiply and expand throughout the entire physical universe eternally, completely unimpeded by sin or death. It's an incredibly vast vision. And the author notes a fascinating historical tragedy here. The religious scholars of the first century completely missed this cosmic architecture. Why? Because they were looking for a localized, temporary political fix. They essentially wanted a conquering general to smash the Roman occupation, lower their taxes, and secure their borders. Instead, they got a suffering servant executing a biological and spiritual rescue mission spanning all of eternity. They tripped over the cure because they entirely misdiagnosed the disease. They wanted a quick surface-level regime change instead of a foundational cellular replacement of human existence.
As we conclude this impartial mapping of an extraordinary structural theology, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought about the fatal nature of experiential knowledge. Think all the way back to the serpent's lie in Eden. The serpent promised that experiencing the knowledge of good and evil would elevate humanity. He essentially sold them the idea that information is inherently elevating, that knowing more automatically makes you better. But this text suggests the exact terrifying opposite. It suggests that knowledge, when uncoupled from the character and the structural capacity to safely handle it, doesn't elevate us at all. It destroys us. It is the raw radiation that poisons the patient who foolishly thought they could handle the power of the sun. In our modern age, where we are absolutely desperate to know and experience absolutely everything, where we scroll endlessly for more data, we often seek quick political or technological fixes, just like the ancients did, completely ignoring the deeper structural problems of our nature. It is definitely worth asking ourselves, in our relentless pursuit of experiential knowledge, is there some information we simply aren't built to carry? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this highly structured journey through such a massive, complex textual architecture has been as fascinating for you as it was for me to map out. Keep learning, stay curious, stay focused, and I'll see you next time.